much, and thank you for the opportunity to provide a somewhat different perspective than my esteemed co-panelists. The UN Sustainable Development Goals set out a critical vision to address some of the most urgent problems impacting humanity. There are 169 proposed targets grouped into 17 goals designed to improve the lives of the poor in emerging countries and how to funnel funding and drive government policy to where it can do the most good. They are really aspirational objectives, and they require buy-in from governments and the private sector. The cost to developing countries has been estimated at between $5 to $7 trillion annually to 2030. For these reasons, they have been criticized as overly ambitious, too numerous, contradictory in parts, and impractical. We need to reconcile competing objectives and avoid going down a utopian path that leads nowhere or worse. That requires hard-headed economic pragmatism over ideology, achievable economic and political goals in place of naive visions, and action plans based on science and the facts instead of moral hectoring and virtue signaling. It also implies drawing from the past rather than ignoring its often hard lessons. So I'm going to comment on some of these issues and those raised in the agenda. The global financial crisis of 2008-2009 had many causes and many culpable individuals and institutions. They include, for the most part, unpunished, unethical, and unlegal behavior of senior industry players, incompetence and conflict of interest of rating agencies, and grievous errors of omission and commission by regulators and politicians. Clearly, we need to protect vulnerable people and societies from future mistakes, excesses, and systemic risk. And critically, the system should work for most people and not just the 0.1%. Still, it would be a serious mistake to abandon the free enterprise model, which has brought growth and prosperity to the developed and developing world, especially when socialist alternatives have repeatedly failed everywhere they've been tried. Furthermore, let's acknowledge that it was not so much that insufficient rules were in place to prevent the collapse. Rather, governments, regulators, rating agencies, and research analysts didn't discharge their responsibilities competently or with integrity, and that the private sector was rife with conflicts of interest and deliberately failed to put the interests of their clients ahead of their personal financial interests, which was their legal duty. The overarching issues for this forum is how best to achieve the proposed SDGs and whose responsibility it is to do so. The agenda asks, among other things, how to improve regulation of the financial system in order to eliminate speculative investments. I have to say that should not be an objective. It would crush entrepreneurship and any chance for inevitably speculative startups from obtaining the capital they need to survive and grow. Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Tesla, green investments, most giant resource companies, retail enterprises, manufacturing companies, they started small and needed angel investing, venture capital, and later stage investors who are willing to take a high risk for substantial reward. Non-accredited investors can be protected by regulators and suitability rules from purchasing securities that are not appropriate for their financial means and investment objectives. Starving risk takers would kill innovation and technological progress, which are critical to growing prosperity and improved living standards around the world. Let me move on to environmental issues, which are a major focus of supporters of SDGs. They are central to companies in the resource industry, often not because of the impact of climate change itself, but rather government policy and social attitude related to the issue. For example, Enbridge and TransCanada Pipelines saw two huge projects terminated in Canada after, in each case, $1 billion in sunk costs, one directly due to government action and the other indirectly. It used to be that running a pipeline company was like watching paint dry. Now the CEO has to take into account a multitude of social, political, regulatory, and economic issues that are very difficult to predict. For other companies, these issues are less relevant. But for every company, there is a need to respond to the greater sophistication and sensitivity of investors and the public, and the possibility that activists will target a company. It's important to connect these issues to the financial and operational performance of a specific company. And that will create better buy-in from employees and investors, align with directors' fiduciary duties, and ensure a long-term commitment. Materiality is the key, so environmental risks should be tied to the business mission. Then the corporation goal can be communicated to stakeholders. Now, Mark Carney, governor of the Bank of England and formerly the Bank of Canada, got together recently with his counterpart at the Bank of France, François Villeroy de Galhau. They both called for a massive reallocation of capital to meet the challenges of climate change. Otherwise, they said, recalcitrant companies would cease to exist. The Network for Greening the Financial System called for greater government oversight of climate risk threatening the stability of the financial system. Evidently, this initiative is not confined to the public sector. Capital stewardship is expected to play a crucial part in the advancement of the SDG agenda. As, quote, no longer absentee landlords, unquote, which they are now called, pension fund trustees seemed poised to exercise their muscle in the boardrooms of America, Canada, many European and some Asian countries. Talk is about applying sustainable investment to different asset classes. In the last couple of years, the World Pension Council held a series of ESG-focused discussions with pension trustees and senior investment executives from across G20 nations, representing $6 trillion in assets, held on the sidelines of the 73rd session of the United Nations General Assembly. Some pension funds are adopting or developing SDG-informed investment processes, especially regarding climate action, gender equity, social fairness, and reduced inequality. Climate Action 100 Plus, a coalition of some of the world's largest investors, together manage over $32 trillion in assets. They've successfully persuaded, or more accurately intimidated, Royal Dutch Shell and BP plc to set short-term goals to accord with the Paris Accord, and that is to transition to a low-carbon economy. CA100 Plus wants companies to explain how climate change will impact their businesses, including worst-case scenarios. Its target was 100 of the systemically important emitters who could be threatened by divestiture if they do not comply with disclosure and align capital to the goal of limiting global warming to less than 2 degrees centigrade. The effort is looking to be successful, but at what cost? One potential implication could be to force some companies to stop pursuing growth and others to deliberately downsize. This represents a massive intervention in the operation of the market system, which has historically always come to grief. Meanwhile, while this goes on in the West, China is quietly looking on with bemusement. While they attempt to save the world, these pension managers should be mindful of their fiduciary responsibility to their pensioners. It's quite remarkable, if not alarming, that representatives of beneficial owners are demanding that companies compromise their returns by constraining the pursuit of profit. They may claim, and they may even believe, that is not the case, since it is in pursuit of longer-term self-interest. But if so, why the need for threats and why the resistance? Now, Mr. Bono raised some plausible reasons, but most board members have the interests of shareholder in mind, including reputation and long-term viability. Negative screening avoids so-called sin companies that do not conform to ESG goals and are otherwise considered unethical. However, the argument that that may result in higher returns misses the point of ethical investing. If investors decide to constrain their investment opportunities, it will likely lower returns. To the extent it does not, investors should be investing that way already. Companies may go along because they fear major pension funds will sell their positions, or because they will believe it will enhance their brand, or because senior management may benefit personally from the praise they'll receive for using shareholder resources to comply with higher purpose goals. Personally, I question whether this is the best or appropriate route to achieve sustainable development goals. Thank you.